I know that the shadow leader is fairly new to opposition, like most of his colleagues, but I might gently say to him that the idea of opposition is to oppose the government, not his own record and his own previous government, because I'm really not quite sure. Last week he attacked our plans to meet climate goals, yet when he was the Minister for Decarbonisation, he seemed to take a very different view, touring the studios, championing net zero. And here we are yet again, he's attacking our plans on national insurance contributions. But when I checked the records, Mr Speaker, I did notice that when his government raised national insurance contributions, not just on businesses, but on workers as well, he was actually the Financial Secretary to the Treasury at the time.
Mr Speaker, a man of your wide culture and extensive learning will doubtless be familiar with the film Mad Max. I am no expert, be it said, but the image it conjures up of a desolate, chaotic landscape with wreckage strewn everywhere is the perfect metaphor for the government's recent budget. Take hospices, for example. In Herefordshire, we are blessed to have the extraordinary St Michael's Hospice. St Michael's supports hundreds of inpatients a year with end-of-life care and thousands more as outpatients and with visits in the community. It has a dedicated staff assisted by some 800 volunteers. This is extraordinary. I shudder to think what it would cost for the state to provide this kind and quality of care, certainly more than £20 million a year. But what has this Labour budget done to St Michael's Hospice? The changes to national insurance alone will cost the hospice an extra £250,000 next year. But that is only part of it, because at the same time the budget has also directly and indirectly pushed up the wage bill by a further £450,000. That's £700,000 annually in extra cost, a vast amount for an organisation that offers incredible care and that actually saves the NHS £20 million a year. There will be hospices in almost every constituency or affecting the interests of almost every colleague in this House. This disastrous outcome was clearly never intended by the Treasury. It's another completely unnecessary blunder with potentially tragic consequences. And as with the GPs and pharmacies, as with mental health and social care charities, no compensation whatsoever has been offered for this tax raid. When will the government publish a proper impact assessment and explain why not? Now, Mr Speaker, there's a direct link here to the issue of assisted dying. In the words of the Health Secretary, no less, I do not think that palliative care, end-of-life care, in this country is in a condition yet where we are giving people the freedom to choose. That care is now being deliberately worsened by his own Chancellor. Personally, I feel very strongly pulled in both directions, by both sides, on the issue of assisted dying. But on one thing, no one can be in any doubt at all, that the government has no business trying to rush this legislation through this House by proxy. The text of the bill was published barely 2 weeks before we vote tomorrow. No impact assessment and no legal issues analysis has been published. Far from public debate preceding legislation, legislation has preceded debate. This is completely the wrong way round. We can be perfectly clear about this. All members of Parliament were recently sent a dossier by the promoter of the bill entitled "Your Questions Answered." Unfortunately, however, far from answering key questions, the dossier fails even to touch upon a whole series of important issues. These include the bill's impact on the medical profession and the relationship between medical staff and patients, and its impact on the provision and regulation of the different drugs and drug cocktails required, the record to date and the protocols to be used in case an initial attempt at assisted dying fails, what the inevitable for-profit industry exploiting the new law will look like and how we should feel about it. And, as the very senior judge, Sir James Munby, has highlighted, a host of questions about the impact of involving the judiciary in the process and the balance of probabilities test for coercion. Most profoundly of all, what choice and dignity actually mean in different contexts. None of these matters is even mentioned in the dossier purporting to give the answers. Whatever one feels about the assisted dying, about the issue of assisted dying itself, and as I say, I feel very pulled in both directions, this absence of debate, especially with so many new members in the House, is a matter of the gravest public concern. And as the House well knows, the government itself is all over the place on this issue. In asking for an assessment of the bill's likely impact on the NHS, the Health Secretary was doing exactly the right thing, preparing civil servants and clinicians for what could be a huge change and asking them to look at a crucial question that has not even been addressed, let alone properly answered. As for the Justice Secretary, she was attacked by none other than her own Labour predecessor, Lord Falconer of Thoroton, for imposing her views. But his lordship somehow missed that she was also making an argument that it was inappropriate in principle for the state to get involved in the provision of what many term assisted suicide. This too is yet another issue that has barely been discussed, and in closing, Mr. Speaker, let me say that the Right Honourable Lady, let me ask the Honourable Lady whether she shares my view that it is a tragedy that colleagues are being asked to vote without a full and proper consideration of the vital issues I have mentioned.
Mr. Speaker, I know that the Shadow Leader is fairly new to opposition, like most of his colleagues, but I might gently say to him that the idea of opposition is to oppose the government, not his own record and his own previous government, because I'm really not quite sure. Last week he attacked our plans to meet climate goals, yet when he was the Minister for Decarbonisation, he seemed to take a very different view, touring the studios, championing net zero. And here we are yet again, he's attacking our plans on national insurance contributions. But when I checked the records, Mr. Speaker, I did notice that when his government raised national insurance contributions, not just on businesses, but on workers as well, he was actually the Financial Secretary to the Treasury at the time. And when he defended the measure at this very dispatch box, Mr. Speaker, he said, and I quote, "It was a profoundly conservative thing to do." So he seemed to be for it then and against it now, and I'm not sure what his position is. I'm quite confused about that. So can I just say to the hospice that he raised and many other hospices like it, that we have made a record investment into the NHS. The hospice sector was left on its knees by his government, and as he knows, the Health Secretary will be coming to this House soon to explain how the record allocation of resources that he has received will be distributed, and that includes to the hospice sector as well. He raises some issues that we are discussing tomorrow on assisted dying, and I have to say, Mr. Speaker, I think it is with some regret that he's chosen this opportunity today to raise those matters in such a political, unnecessarily political fashion. This is an issue that does generate very emotive sort of responses on both sides, and I hope that the conversations that we have tomorrow and the debate we have tomorrow can be conducted in a respectful, considerate, non-partisan, non-political matter. And he asked a question about time and scrutiny, which I have raised here before. I am very confident, as the leader of this House, that this bill will undergo sufficient scrutiny. It will have sufficient time for consideration. And as I have previously said at the dispatch box, Mr. Speaker, that it is, of course, the government will, of course, implement whatever the will of this House is. And I have previously said as well, Mr. Speaker, that should the House choose to give such a bill, this bill tomorrow, its second reading, then the government will, of course, work with the sponsoring MP to make sure that that bill and the policy is both workable, operable and will be implemented. And that will mean working with the sponsoring MP on tidying up any necessary measures in the bill, and the departments getting to work straight away on what that means in terms of implementation, assessment and other documentation that he outlines. And should the House decline to give its second reading tomorrow, then of course that work would not happen. And of course, as I have previously said, after several weeks in committee, the first opportunity for that bill to return to this House will not be until the end of April. That is a considerable amount of time for the government to do that work and for us to consider that bill further. So I will leave it there, Mr. Speaker.